Today, we're going to be talking about the Hollywood strike and its impact on the Black community. We're also going to be discussing what the corporate media is failing to tell you. So, if you are interested in this topic or you don't know anything about it, I encourage you to stay and listen because I promise you, you will get something out of this. So, stay tuned right after this. Hey, y'all, what's up? Welcome back to the show. My name is attorney Chloe Corbett, also known as the Duchess of Justice. I'm one half of the Defiant Lawyers, a show that I have here with my dad, Augustus Corbett. He won't be here today, he's in the background producing things, but I do have a very special guest with me today. Again, we are the Defiant Lawyers, and we provide legal analysis of trending politics, policies, personalities, and pop culture to empower each and every person that listens to us, that views this video, to take this information and disseminate it to your community and to empower each and every one of you all. So while I don't have my dad here today, I do have a very, very special guest who I am about to introduce. Her name is Attorney T. Maxine Woods McMillan. She is an employment lawyer who focuses on employment law, business dispute resolution, workplace equity, and equality. She is an advocate in the areas of discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, pregnancy, religion, and other areas. Before she became an attorney, she was a credentialed human resources executive, a certified mediator, and she was also a sought after HR consultant. Not only that, but last but not least, guys, she is a very dedicated and loving wife and mother. So, with that, I want you all to help me introduce Attorney Maxine. Thank you and welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I am so glad that you are here. And just to tell our viewers how we met at a CLE, which is a continuing legal education program, in which you were a speaker and gave a very powerful speech about a presentation about labor law. And after that, we connected, we remained friends. And as this Hollywood strike has continued and the conversations that we've had, I knew that you were the perfect person to be up here and to educate our viewers and to talk about this topic. So, welcome once again, okay?
Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. So, I want to divide this up into about 6 segments. And I want this to be a free flowing conversation where we provide education to our listeners. For those of you all who don't know or who have not been following the news, there are two strikes that are going on in Hollywood. There is the writer's strike through the Writers Guild that started in May of this year, and then there is the actors strike through the SAG-AFTRA that started as well. And this is the first time in more than 60 years where both of these guilds have been on strike at the same time. And what they are striking for is, basic um, equal income for the members of the guild, as well as making sure that there's equity in residual income from all of the streaming services that are happening as well. And so, and a lot of black actors and black members of these unions have spoke out too. And so I wanted to make sure that we had this conversation to put in the mind of when you think of Hollywood, you typically think of a rich, successful actor, but there
Right.
are a lot of black people, black actors, writers, journalists, other people in the industry who may not receive as much attention that this strike is affecting them as well. So, how did you
Mhm.
first hear about these strikes, and what were your initial thoughts? It seems like we may have lost Attorney Maxine. Can you all hear me? Oh, welcome back. Can you hear me?
I'm back. I'm not sure what happened. Technical difficulties, but we're going to
Yes.
go past it anyway.
Yes,
Um,
this is live. There's some kink. Okay, so
yeah. So
can you
what
tell me
we're
how you first heard about the strike, Maxine?
Yeah, so I first heard about the strike, kind of like everyone else did. I heard kind of the rumblings that it was happening. I happen to have a colleague in passing that's an entertainment lawyer that told me, some things are not kind of going the way they're supposed to go. And quite honestly, it was, added to the list, right? Um, but it was when we really started hearing about the Writers Guild, and I first heard a pundit ask, "Okay, well, I wonder what that's going to mean for the rest of us, right?" Uh, and I started thinking about, hey, what is that going to mean for the rest of us? Because at the end of the day, when you talk about strikes, I think your first point in your lead-in makes so much sense. When we think about people going on strike and we talk about Hollywood, we hear Hollywood and we think about, the famous actor, and we can't necessarily correlate that, equate that with our lives, because you're supposedly negotiating a $15 million or $30 million film deal. Like, most of us can't even conceptualize those kind of numbers, at least in our personal capacity, right? Um, and so I think it's really important to think about the strikes that we're discussing. The people that are striking are not striking over $1 million deals. We are literally talking about, and this is where the familiarity comes in. We're talking about people who are saying, I want to make sure that, you know, what I work for is protected. I want to make sure that I'm able to plan ahead for my future financially, so that the money that I make, my pension, my future is secured. Um, I think it's really important to think about, for example, uh, in terms of SAG, Screen Actors Guild. In order to get health insurance, you need to make the minimum, right? The minimum for SAG last year was $26,470. $26,470 was what you had to make as a Screen Actors Guild member to be eligible for health insurance. Now,
Mm,
here's my question. What percentage of Screen Actors Guild members do you think made enough to be eligible for health insurance last year? What would you
mm.
think?
If I had to guess, I would hope all, but maybe 70%.
Nope. Less.
Mm, 50,
Less.
25.
Less.
Okay, why don't you tell us?
12.7%.
Mm,
So that means of their complete membership, the people that we're talking about, only 12.7% made enough as working actors, or, support staff or background. Only 12.7% made enough to be eligible for health insurance.
mm. I
That
mean, that
means
is an
only
indictment.
12.7% made
Yeah, yeah.
$26,470. How many of us could live and support a family? And keep in mind, where a good majority, not all, but where a good majority of these actors reside: California or New York. Now, I'm from New York originally. I've never lived in Cali, but I've definitely lived in New York. Who is making it, living this extravagant life on $26,470, right? And so what we're doing is, we are compelling people to be in a situation. They have to be they have to work multiple jobs. They have to push themselves to a degree that should not be required, where they can't hone their craft, they can't develop their skill set, and get a living wage, be able to command a living wage in those areas. They literally cannot do that and survive. So that's part of the conversation as well. You can't say you're going to pay me slate, you're going to pay me the base minimum, and expect that you're going to pay me that, and then add on top of it, you get to pay me late with no penalty. And I'm sure we'll get to that later. But you get to pay me late with no penalty, and then you bring technology into it, and that's part of the calculus as well. And then the time constraints and all of that that I'm sure we'll get to in this conversation. It's no longer reasonable, and so we have historical precedent for what has to happen when we have a capitalist class that essentially only looks at people in the context of their productivity, and we look at optimization solely as a numerical or economic value, and not take into account how imperative it is that, one, we respect the craft, because this is work. These actors are working, and two, that the people that capitalize, the people that benefit from this labor, are the people that are producing the labor. And we definitely know that as Black people, we can appreciate that there's something to be said for uh, having people engage in work for which they don't derive the best and most prominent economic benefit. That's problematic.
It is. And the historical precedent that you mentioned, that's a great segue to how I want to contextualize this conversation. And I want to trace the roots of the relationship between chattel slavery, which America was dependent on, in which a majority of Americans still receive um,
Mhm,
income and wealth from that system of slavery with the
mhm,
labor movement. Because the
mhm,
African Americans who were enslaved in this country as chattel slaves, as we know, one, they were considered property, and two, they were forced to work via unpaid labor. And based
mhm.
on the back of that unpaid labor for over 250 years, America was built. So all of the systems that we're able to enjoy today was were likely built on the backs of those unpaid enslaved persons. And so I want to get your thoughts on the relationship between chattel slavery and the labor movement, and why we can put them together and learn from that movement and apply it to today as well.
I mean, I think that the line was never broken, right? One, because we refuse to have the national conversation all at the same time, not in reaction to something, not in reaction to someone being killed or a particular event, but a national ongoing conversation that just doesn't just contextualize and acknowledge it, which we haven't done. But once we acknowledge it, then start to formulate responsive action that looks like actualized legislation, that looks like codified law, that looks like codified practice. We have not done that. So we're going to keep going around this mulberry bush. We're going to keep having this conversation over and over again because we have not addressed it. But in terms of what we're looking at today, there has literally not been a time in American historical precedent in which there has not been a resistance of people saying, there is a problem with me being the one engaging in labor and another party being the one deriving economic benefit and not allowing me an equal opportunity, not an entitlement, but an opportunity to engage in that benefit as well. Right. So we know, as you said, that in slavery, that wasn't even a conversation. It wasn't even a consideration. Why? Because it wasn't even our labor that was commodified. It was our very beings, our very bodies that were commodified and were seen as part of the asset structure. And then the labor that it produced, that our bodies produced, were also part of that asset structure. So when we're talking now about people saying, if I'm going to be an entertainment factor for you, if I am going to be part of the product which you market to the larger society, I should derive benefit from that as well, and that benefit should be commensurate not only to my input but to the success of this commodity in the marketplace. I think that's a conversation that we need to keep pushing, and we need to compel in the larger conversation. Because, and I think off air, when you and I were talking earlier before the show, when has there not been a time when the people that have been giving kind of the collective society enjoyment and benefit not been Black people, right? Whether it's been at our expense or we have been the people delivering it. And so there's something to be said for when we are commodified for what we produce, whether that's the sweat of our brow or the brilliance of our creative mind, and we're not the ones that are deriving economic benefit from that. So I think that's a consideration for your actors and your theater workers and your writers, and everyone behind the scenes that makes, kind of the production go. Um, I was when I was thinking about this, in terms of the writers and how do we, best think about what the writers bring to the table. I was having a conversation with my son, and I said, think about your favorite movie, and he told me his favorite movie, and I said, great, who's the star? And of course, he told me the star, and I said, great, now who wrote it? Like, not who directed it, not who the big name, star was that got tens of millions of dollars, but who wrote the actual script. Most of us can't name the actual writers of the script of our favorite movie or our favorite TV show. Um, and these are, regular middle class earning people. They're not usually huge millionaires. And so the question becomes, when that person is producing something that ends up being um, financially beneficial to the tune of millions of dollars for production studios, for production executives. Why is it that we're having this conversation where writers are not seeing that benefit, or their residuals are being fronted at the front end, but they're not getting it at the back end? We know that we can't compel them with the same federal labor laws in terms of compensation that anyone else can, right? FLSA is not applicable here, right? So what do we do then? That's where their contracts are supposed to ensure that they have the benefits afforded to them as part of a labor force, because we have to see them as such. We have to be mindful that although what they're doing is creative, that creative commodity is a product, and it is a commodity in the marketplace. And so if it's been commodified such that there's a monetary value that is assessed from it, derived from it, it has to be afforded to the working class as well.
Yeah, what you're talking about is reclaiming the humanity of the workers
Mhm.
and for
Mhm.
everyone else who is involved in these strikes. And what I want people to know is, who exactly are we talking about? Just like you said, it's not necessarily in that conversation that you had with your son, the actors, but it's writers, it is broadcast journalists, it is voice actors, it is the stunt performers, it is the makeup artists, and a whole host of other people who go unnamed. But Hollywood would not be what it is. The studios would not make the billions upon and even trillions of dollars that they make each year if it were not for those people. And so, in my mind, the similarity between what the workers are striking for now and reclaiming their humanity is what our ancestors had to do as well. That is the main connection, because as we know, like we said before, with chattel slavery, in the Constitution, in the laws, the law deemed African Americans as property. My dad, we did a search of our ancestry, and we had to go to the court records and look at the deeds, because under American law, when you would keep inventory of property of Black people, we were seen as property, they would keep a deed for each of the enslaved persons that they had under their care. And that's how we were able to go through our ancestry. So, what African Americans have been fighting for, leading up to the civil rights movement, and of course with Dr. King, is just reclaiming our humanity under the American capitalistic system, under the institutional systems that do not see very poor people, African American people, minorities as human, and that's what we've been fighting for. And speaking of Dr. King, we were discussing off air too how he was making his transition from general civil rights to labor rights as well. What a lot of people don't know is that when he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, it was to march on Washington for jobs and freedom. That's the part that gets left out. So even in the early 1960s, he was making that transition from voting rights at the bus boycotting to labor rights and fair wages and equity for workers as well. And then, as we know, he was assassinated while he was at a sanitary worker union strike as well. So
On
when we
his way there.
combine what Dr. King was doing in the civil rights movement, leading us into today, um, what do you think the basic humanity that the workers are doing in Hollywood now is connected to us as African Americans, and how can we take what they're doing and apply it in our own communities as well?
Well, the first thing is we have to make sure that we are not seeing ourselves as disconnected from what's happening in Hollywood, right? What's happening in Hollywood is essentially an economic condition. It's an economic conversation about labor, and to quote Dr. King said essentially the concerns of the Negro people, that was his term at the time, the concerns of the Negro people are the same as are the concerns of the labor or working class. He was an honorary Local 10 union member. And the conversation he was having was we have to understand that these are not separate battles. So I think it's actually instructive, right, for where we are today, because we hear so much about, well, why can't we just remove race? Why can't we just have a conversation that completely is race neutral, that doesn't talk about race at all? Well, because race is a fault line in our collective conscience in the American story, there really is no way to not have this conversation and not include race. One, because as I said, it's a fault line in all of American society. But two, whenever there's an economic factor, you've heard the saying, when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. So these economic conditions that we're talking about are going to impact all of us differently, but impact Black Americans in a particular way. For example, when we talk about only 12.7% of SAG members being able to get health insurance, well, this is for a community where the Black maternal death rate is a little over twice that of white women, white American women. That's a concern. If you are looking at women that are going into pregnancy situations and they do not have the same health privileges, they don't even have health insurance if possible, that's going to be part of the conversation as well. I think when we are having a conversation about optimization, productivity, economic benefit or advantage or disadvantage. And we look at it purely in economic terms. And we do not engage that conversation in the context of the humanity of people collectively. And we don't require the corporate entities that kind of um, uh, 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 help us navigate how we understand these economic conditions. We don't require them to have a corporate conscience. We lose part of our collective conscience as well. It is imperative that we not take kind of the corporate line hook and sinker where we are looking at optimization and productivity as capitalist benefit, and we only see those terms purely in the context of economics and purely in the context of monetary value. Optimization has to be included in how we perceive a person's success in terms of their overall health. And when we aren't only looking at if we were to only look at productivity, slavery makes sense,
Mm,
right? If we were to only consider capitalism, America's advancement, and how quickly America became a superpower on the backs of unpaid labor and unrequited economic benefit of Africans stolen from their homes. If we were to only look at that purely in economic capitalistic terms, that makes perfect sense,
mhm.
right? Why would you not think that was a great idea? Because your balance sheet's going to look wonderful. right? Your labor costs are zero or almost zero. We were at one point in this country's history, it is factual, that it was more fiscally advantageous. It made more fiscal sense to buy a black man, work said black man literally to death, not even afford said black man the dignity of a burial, and then go back and get another black man. It made more sense to work that person to death fiscally than it did to feed him properly, to clothe him in the winter, to give him secure housing, and to ensure he had adequate time to rest and recover, both in body and soul. There is no line item. If you are looking at these things purely in an economic sense, there's no line item for collective conscience. There's no line item for health of soul. There's no line item for moral collective moral identity unless we make that a requirement. Unless we compel it as part of the collective conscience. Unless we require that I will not spend US currency if you can explain to me what your corporate identity is, such that you make that, you compel me to be in business with you. If we don't require it, it does not, there is no compulsion on the part of capitalism to require that. There must be a compulsion on the part of the collective conscience to say, this is required for me. You absolutely have to have this as part of your identity for me to feel compelled to engage in capitalistic interaction with you.
What you're talking about is one of the things that we talk about so much on this show, which is the need for African Americans to be proactive instead of reactive. So when something happens in America, when there's a police brutality incident, when there's some type of other economic injustice, we typically are reactive instead of being proactive and unionizing, having organizations come together, doing things to demand that these huge corporations that benefit from off of the backs still over 200 years later from the unpaid labor of African Americans, demanding that there is human respect and human dignity in that vein. In addition, there's a lot of research that shows that a lot of African Americans are in service industries. So whether it be
Mm,
nursing or in the social services industry, or even auto workers, those type of industries that are really service focused. And because of that, I believe that there needs to be a look to see what Hollywood is doing, a a a city in LA that has the money and the resources behind it to say, okay, how can we do that in each of our respective communities? Whether I'm a
mhm,
nurse working all of these hours and I'm not getting paid for the labor that I have, or whether I'm a an auto worker and I need to get paid for fair wages as well. So we need to take the blueprint from what some rich people in Hollywood and others who are not, take that blueprint and incorporate it into each of the industries that we're in as African Americans and be proactive. That's why I was so excited when I saw Chris Smalls, who was a union leader with Amazon, a former Amazon worker.